Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer. We're going to take some pretty complex historical and political topics and basically break them down so you can truly understand the forces shaping our world today. Right now, we're looking at Austria. You know, it's a country with a deeply complex, layered history, and recently, well, those historical fault lines have been literally erupting right out on the city's streets. To understand exactly why that's happening, we absolutely have to look at the concept of Austrian anti-fascism.
Just look at July 20th, 2024. The streets of Vienna basically descended into total chaos. We saw masked individuals throwing stones and bottles, which led to 43 temporary arrests. The police had to deploy pepper spray multiple times just to control the crowds, and 3 officers actually ended up getting injured. It was this stark, physical manifestation of ideological conflict playing out in real time. But you've got to ask, who exactly was clashing here?
Now, what's really interesting about this is how clearly defined the two modern groups at the center of this clash actually are. So on one side, you had the far-right identitarian movement, and they were marching under the controversial slogan of remigration. Then, on the other side, anti-fascist and left-wing groups organized immediate counter-events, like sit-in blockades, to physically disrupt the march. Even politicians from the Green Party and the SPO explicitly supported these counter-demonstrations, warning against ethno-nationalist ideologies. But here's the thing. This fierce modern-day standoff, it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
To truly grasp the urgency of these modern street clashes, we actually need to zoom out and travel back in time. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to define Austrian anti-fascism, explore the historical resistance, track the evolution of the movement, look at how the past is documented, and finally, analyze the modern political landscape.
Okay, moving right along to Section 1, Defining Austrian Anti-Fascism. Let's get our baseline set.
If you look at a political lexicon, anti-fascism, or anti-fascism, is defined pretty simply as political opposition to fascism. But in Austria, it has a very specific 3-part historical timeline. It covers opposition to the Austro-fascist state from 1933 to 1938, then the resistance during the German Nazi occupation from 1938 to 1945, and finally, all the post-1945 efforts to combat any reawakening of neo-Nazi tendencies. It's essentially 3 distinct historical eras wrapped into one concept. Now, what you really should take away from this is that anti-fascism in Austria isn't just some modern protest movement. It's not a fringe ideology. It's literally written into the foundational DNA of the modern republic. The 1955 Austrian State Treaty legally obligated the nation to decisively counter any fascist tendencies, so it's actually a constitutional imperative.
Let's move to Section 2, the historical resistance, and see how this builds.
Because the origins of this movement? They might actually surprise you. Today, like we saw in those Vienna protests, anti-fascism is primarily perceived as a very left-wing, youth-driven phenomenon. But the early resistance in Austria completely defied this modern left-right political binary. Actually, the historical resistance included Catholic conservatives, bourgeois citizens, and these incredibly diverse cross-ideological groups who all just shared one common enemy.
A really prime example of this cross-ideological courage is the AFO, which stands for the Anti-Fascist Freedom Movement of Austria. Founded in 1941 and operating largely down in Styria and Carinthia, this group was not started by radical leftists. It was actually founded by a Catholic priest named Anton Gronig. Under his leadership, the AFO united Catholics, members of student fraternities, ethnic Slovenes, and even groups of Marxists.
They produced underground leaflets and even planned sabotage against the Gestapo, and their messaging was incredibly bold. One of their leaflets passionately read, "Corinthians to action, all united against the brown criminals." They were desperately trying to wake the public up to the grim reality of the Nazi regime.
What's also fascinating here is how they explicitly reached across ethnic lines, which, let's be honest, was incredibly dangerous at the time. Another leaflet directly addressed the Corinthian Slovenes, declaring, "Slovenes, brothers and sisters, into the front of anti-fascism." They were building a unified front that totally ignored the borders the Nazis were trying to enforce.
But of course, this courage came at an unimaginable cost. In July 1943, the AFO was discovered and crushed by the Gestapo. 65 members were identified, and tragically, 8 of these brave individuals were sentenced to death by the People's Court and executed.
That brings us to Section 3, Evolution of a Movement. Let's see how things transformed after the war.
For decades after the war, the movement was relatively small. In the 1950s, you mostly just saw small left-wing groups protesting against right-wing gatherings. Then, in 1965, things escalated tragically when an anti-fascist named Ernst Kirchweger was killed at a demonstration. But the real turning point? That came later, in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, where the rise of the right-wing FPO party sparked the creation of much more militant, youth-driven anti-fascist subcultures.
The reason the late 1980s was such a massive catalyst was largely because of the Kurt Waldheim affair. Why this matters is that up until then, Austria had largely promoted this myth that it was merely the first victim of Nazi Germany. But the controversies surrounding presidential candidate Waldheim's wartime record, it completely shattered that post-war silence. For the first time, broad Austrian society was forced to openly discuss its own complicity in Nazi crimes. It was a huge wake-up call.
As that historical awareness grew, the targets of the movement shifted. By the 2000s, anti-fascist groups really expanded their focus. They weren't just looking out for neo-Nazis anymore. They began combating broader right-wing populism, the rising tide of anti-Islamism, and what they called the brown zone. That was the overlapping area where established conservative elites would mingle with right-wing extremists at events, like the highly controversial WKR ball in Vienna.
Let's look at Section 4, documenting the past, because anti-fascism isn't just about protesting.
And this brilliantly illustrates that point. The Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, or DOE, basically bridges the gap between the past and the present. They gather testimonies of the WWI resistance, they maintain massive databases of Shoah and Gestapo victims, and they host public history exhibitions. But crucially, they also actively monitor modern right-wing extremism. It just goes to show that remembering the past is an active, vital tool for the present.
Another really vital site is the Perschmanhof Museum down in Carinthia, which preserves the often suppressed history of the Slovene partisan resistance. But here's the thing. These sites aren't just quiet, static museums. They remain active, sometimes volatile spaces of political tension. In fact, during an anti-fascist camp, the Perschmanhof site experienced a massive, highly controversial police raid, which caused an international scandal and highlighted just how sensitive this history still is today.
All right, let's bring it all together in Section 5, the modern political landscape.
Today, there's a serious intellectual debate, even among left-leaning thinkers, regarding the term anti-fascism itself. It's known as the Fascismuskeule, or Fascism Club debate. The central question is this. If we label every modern right-wing populist or anti-immigrant group as fascist, do we risk inflating the term so much that we actually trivialize the horrific historical reality of actual 1930s fascism? It's a really complex debate over the power and the limits of language in politics.
And that leaves us with this final thought. From a Catholic priest printing illegal leaflets in 1941 to masked protesters clashing with police over immigration in 2024, the fight against perceived fascism has radically transformed. But as political divides across Europe continue to deepen, how will the definition and the everyday actions of anti-fascism continue to evolve in Austria? It's a fascinating question and one that history clearly hasn't finished answering yet. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.